I'd now like to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Helen Irving from the Faculty of Law, for her Key Thinker lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. In coming to this talk, I assume you know a little bit about the subject, Mary Wollstonecraft. At least you know her name and her dates of birth and death. And perhaps you know something from the summary of the Key Thinkers on the Key Thinkers website. Or perhaps, who knows, you have a distant memory of the feminist movement of the 1970s. If nothing else, you will know that Wollstonecraft lived in the 18th century. But imagine for a moment that you were entirely ignorant of her life and knew nothing at all about her biography or the period in which she lived and worked. Imagine then reading an obituary like this. Mary Wollstonecraft was an English-born journalist, educationalist and novelist and political theorist. She devoted many years of her short life and the majority of her considerable energies to the goal of women's rights, the education of girls and gender equality. She wrote several books in her 20s and early 30s, including a major work on women's liberation, which was published in England, and then almost immediately afterwards in several editions in America, as well as in translation. She was not only an armchair radical, but took an active interest in assisting other women to escape from unhappy marriages or oppressive family circumstances. She also observed firsthand the progress of a violent revolution in a foreign country, staying on after other foreign correspondents and visitors had left, writing an account of her experiences and observing the events unfolding. There she became involved in a relationship with a visiting American, which led to the birth of her daughter in France, with whom she would soon return to England to live as a single mother. She would subsequently travel again with her infant and nanny to several remote countries, which she described and chronicled in a further published work. While she achieved fame and considerable success as a writer in her lifetime, she found personal happiness only towards the end in a new relationship with a fellow radical. They married after she fell pregnant, but continued to maintain separate households and lead independent, albeit close and companionate lives. Tragically, Mary's life was cut short at the age of only 38, following the birth in London of her second daughter. Her pregnancy had been uncomplicated and her health was strong, but 10 days after giving birth, the placenta having failed fully to come away, she succumbed to uterine septicemia. She was survived by her husband William and her daughters Frances and Mary. If you knew nothing else about our subject, only the final statement would give things away. In every other respect, this could be the obituary of a women's liberationist of the 1970s or even a feminist of our recent times. But of course it is not. Her obituary would have ended differently. It would most likely have appeared later had it been. Mary Wollstonecraft died, as we see, in 1797 of an infection that in England or other parts of the developed world would be easily treatable today. As a young, healthy woman in England, she need not have died as she did. That we can say this with confidence is due to progress in medical science and modern obstetric practices, combined with greater control women have gained over their own fertility, in particular in the last 50 years. We can add to our story that Wollstonecraft need not today have suffered scandal or social opprobrium because of her premarital relationships and single motherhood, or faced the certain loss of her legal rights and independence in marrying. These developments were the result of the slow but ultimately dramatic progress made over the last 2 centuries. The shifts are in many cases quite recent. Some have occurred within my own lifetime, but they are ultimately the outcome or the expression of the ideas that Wollstonecraft herself promoted: access to education, challenges to tradition and superstition, the growth of reason and tolerance. All are legacies of the Enlightenment, legacies of the work of Mary Wollstonecraft and other radical egalitarians of her age, as well as those who followed. Education and reproductive rights. These are the foundations of women's equality. If girls cannot enjoy education, if women cannot be confident of surviving pregnancy, then equality is not achievable. Political and legal rights are, of course, vital, and they serve as the stepping stone for other forms of equality, but their enjoyment is compromised where girls are not educated and when women cannot control their own fertility. Mary Wollstonecraft lived in an era and moved in circles where she was able to take advantage of the opportunities for an education. She knew that these opportunities were available to only a few. She believed that the principles of equality and reason, the key themes of the Enlightenment, should extend to all, to girls as well as boys, women as well as men. She lived a life that reflected these ideals, but she could not, of course, yet enjoy the great other fruits of the Enlightenment, the growth of science and modern medicine. These observations must be qualified, however. They apply to Wollstonecraft as an Englishwoman of the 18th century, or Wollstonecraft's counterpart, an Englishwoman of today. They still do not apply in many parts of the world, in many countries, where girls are denied even basic education, the basic education that girls of Wollstonecraft's time and class were likely to receive. In many of the same countries, women, often still only girls, suffer her fate, dying as a result of pregnancy. This is not just a tragedy, it is a scandal of the modern world. In 1797, the medicines for treating septicemia and other complications of pregnancy and childbirth were simply not available. They are now in 2009. In 2009, the medical skills and technologies to intervene when complications in childbirth arise are well developed. Mary Wollstonecraft's life and ideas are relevant today, not only because of their historical importance, but because they still apply. They are still needed in much of the world. The theme of her best-known work, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, was justice for one half of the human race. This goal is still far from being accomplished. I will come back to this theme. But I turn now to Mary Wollstonecraft's life and work. We've already heard the summary. Let me now fill it out. Wollstonecraft was born on the 27th of April, 1759. She died in September 1797, as we know, at the age of 38. She was raised in a conventional household which valued its sons ahead of its daughters, and of its daughters, Mary least of all. Yet there was something extraordinary about her, perceived by others, if not her parents. Friendship and the patronage of older, influential women, plus employment of the only type available to middle-class women in that era, as a lady's companion, as a teacher and a governess, became her first means of escape. In 1784, she also took the first in the pattern of unorthodox, indeed scandalous, steps that were to mark the rest of her life, assisting her sister to desert her husband, escaping from an unhappy marriage. This, at the time, flouted not only social standards, but had serious legal consequences. In their flight, Mary and her sister risked arrest, as well as the violent response of her husband. The women escaped, but the loss of the legal custody of her sister's children was the price Eliza Wollstonecraft paid. There could be no extenuating circumstances or test of capacity to raise children or the child's best interest. Until well into the 20th century, the deserting mother could not have custody. With her sister's independence came Mary Wollstonecraft's own experience of independent living. The sisters and Wollstonecraft's close friend, Fanny Blood, set up a school together in their early 20s. Although the school did not thrive, Wollstonecraft derived her early theories of education from the experience. These were to form an important part of her work and legacy, both in their own right and in relation to her vindication of the rights of woman. Fanny Blood's marriage in 1785 took her to Portugal. Wollstonecraft visited her there, a perilous journey by boat of more than 2 weeks. It was to be the first of her travels alone in and around Europe. In Lisbon, Fanny's health deteriorated during her pregnancy. Her child was stillborn and she died soon after. Wollstonecraft returned to England, devastated, and found a position in Ireland as a governess to the daughters of an aristocratic Anglo-Irish family. She arrived there to find 4 girls, their imaginations and expectations dull and conventional, prepared only for future marriages and hostile to their new governess. By the time of her departure, 1 year later, these children had become devoted to her. Their intellects, they attested, had been widened, and they were freed from all superstitions, as the eldest girl, Margaret King, was later to write. And King would herself later leave her married home, living and studying alone in Italy and becoming a medical practitioner, perhaps the first, I don't know, British woman to do so. Wollstonecraft returned to London, determined to live and work as a writer. She had a measure of success, including as a translator, reviewer and editorial assistant. Through her publisher, Joseph Johnson, she was introduced into the radical circles of fin de siècle London, and little by little began to systematise her theories of women's independence and liberation. She wrote a work of pedagogy, a novel, a children's storybook, and in 1790 edited an anthology called The Female Reader. I'll just give you the list of Mary Wollstonecraft's writings and their dates. In London in the same year, 1790, she wrote her first Vindication, The Vindication of the Rights of Man, a celebration of political and constitutional reform, written in response to Edmund Burke's conservative tract, Reflections on the Revolution in France. In 1791, while Wollstonecraft was working on her second Vindication, a now famous dinner party took place at Joseph Johnson's house in London. It was held to honour the great theorist and activist Thomas Paine, whose own now more famous work, The Rights of Man, published 1 year later than Mary's, had appeared that year, 1791. Among the guests at the dinner party were Wollstonecraft and also William Godwin, who would soon publish his own radical work entitled An Inquiry into Political Justice, which was published in 1793. Some years later, Godwin would write about this dinner. He had gone along to meet Thomas Paine. Indeed, he said he had a very great curiosity to see Thomas Paine. And although Wollstonecraft's first Vindication had brought her some fame and some notoriety, Godwin confessed that he had little curiosity to see her. But throughout the dinner, Paine spoke little and Mary Wollstonecraft spoke a lot. I heard her very frequently, Godwin wrote, when I wished to hear Paine. He did not like her, and it was mutual. Some of you will already know, however, what the final result of this meeting was to be. Wollstonecraft's personal life at that time was dominated by a relationship with the artist Henry Fuseli, a married man. At its unhappy conclusion, she made the extraordinary decision to travel alone to France to observe the unfolding revolution at first hand. She arrived shortly before the execution of Louis XVI and was witness to the king and other prisoners being carried through the streets to the guillotine. The English were fleeing Paris by then, but Wollstonecraft made up her mind not to leave, and it was a decision that was to have critical consequences for her. A biographical introduction alluding to these consequences, a biographical introduction to an 1889 edition of her last book, which was published in 1796, describes her experience thus. Arriving in Paris, Wollstonecraft felt lonely and sad. Strong womanly instincts were astir within her, and they were not all wise folk who had been drawn around her by the generous enthusiasm for the new hopes of the world that made it then, as Wordsworth felt, a very heaven to the young. In other words, in revolutionary France, she became involved in a disastrous affair. Her lover was an American, Gilbert Imlay. Wollstonecraft fell pregnant, and in early 1794 she gave birth to her daughter Frances Fanny, named after her dead friend. Wollstonecraft had been opposed to the institution of marriage and had written of it in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman as the equivalent of slavery, an institution in which women became property and invariably lost their legal rights and their personal independence. When she was first involved with Imlay, she did not want to marry him, and by the time her child was born, he no longer wanted to maintain the relationship. Despite her adverse circumstances, she continued to write, including an early history of the French Revolution, entitled, as we see, An Historical and Moral View of the Origin and Progress of the French Revolution, published in 1795 during her residence there. When the situation in France became increasingly dangerous and radicals, including Thomas Paine himself, were imprisoned, she finally left Paris, posing as Imlay's wife, availing herself of the protection of his American citizenship. Soon after returning to London, she set out on another trip at the behest of her former lover to inquire into a business venture of his. With her infant daughter and her child's nanny, she travelled to Scandinavia, a relatively undeveloped part of Europe at that time, and while there wrote an account of her travels in the form of letters to Imlay. These were published in 1796 as letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. In London again, finally facing the inevitability of the end of her affair with Imlay, Mary attempted suicide, throwing herself in the River Thames to drown, the fate of many fallen women in those days. And an interesting historical note here, Mary was rescued by the intervention of an organisation, the Humane Society, established in 1774, which had adopted a practice of paying boatmen on the river to bring insensible bodies, what they called the recent drowned, pulled from the water, as long as it was within a specified period of time, to bring the boatmen were paid to bring those insensible persons to receiving houses that had been established near the river. There, the new techniques of artificial respiration were applied, bringing back, apparently, many from the dead. And thus Wollstonecraft's life was saved, for a time at least. Gradually, Wollstonecraft returned to the life she had enjoyed before her travels to France, rejoining Joseph Johnson's circle and meeting William Godwin again. Godwin, in the meanwhile, had read her travel account, her letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. He was impressed. It is not hard to see why. The book is an extraordinary work. It is a combination of travel-log, acute anthropological and social observations, deep personal introspection, measured but uncompromising commentary on the condition of women, and sublime descriptions of nature and landscape. The letters are beautifully constructed, and the sentiments are at once delicate and forceful. We see in her themes, her style and her expression the combination of sensibility and rationality that she defended in her theoretical writings, like many of the earlier Enlightenment thinkers. Passion, in her understanding of the human mind, inspires action, but reason ultimately must prevail. This thinking had already been expressed in her previous writings, including her account of the French Revolution. The appalling and terrifying events she witnessed in France during the Terror were to prove deep trials for her ideals, her republican and democratic ideals, and her principles of equality. She would write of the Revolution, "The vivid changes, the violent, the base and nefarious assassinations which have clouded the vivid prospect that had begun to spread a ray of joy and gladness over the gloomy horizon of oppression cannot fail to chill the sympathising bosom and the intellectual vigour. To sketch these vicissitudes is a task so arduous and melancholy that it is with a heart trembling it becomes necessary to guard against the erroneous inferences of sensibility, and reason beaming on the grand theatre of political changes can prove the only sure guide to direct us to a favourable or just conclusion." The French, she concluded in that work, had done terrible things in the course of their revolution in response to terrible oppression and inequalities, but reason would prevail. The world, she concluded, would, at least from the long view of history, be grateful for their example. We see this struggle between the sentimental, the sensible, and the rational on a personal plane in the letters from Scandinavia, in her own attempt to control her emotions. She is doubtful of succeeding. "You have sometimes wondered, my dear friend," she writes to Imlay, "at the extreme affection of my nature, but such is the temperament of my soul. For years I have endeavoured to calm an impetuous tide, labouring to make my feelings take an orderly course. It was striving against the stream. I must love and admire with warmth, or I sink into sadness. We see her tremendous courage as she immerses herself in the often uncomfortable experience of travelling and observing, and ultimately allows it to triumph and to restore, at least for a time, her emotional health. The knowledge that the letters are written to her former lover, the father of her child, and the man who has abandoned her, gives them a deep poignancy. Well, William Godwin, you will recall, had not enjoyed the meeting with Wollstonecraft when they met at the dinner, where he had hoped to listen to Thomas Paine instead of her. But reading this book, he changed his mind. Of it, he would say, "If ever there was a book calculated to make a man in love with its author, this appears to me to be the book." No one's ever written that about a book of mine. Godwin and Wollstonecraft became lovers. When she became pregnant, they married, despite their shared opposition to the institution. Thus, paradoxically, the scandal that was henceforth to surround her name was set in train. Her marriage to Godwin exposed the fact that she had not been married to Imlay. Their living arrangements in separate but adjoining houses were also scrutinised, but by all accounts they were happy, briefly. It ended tragically. Wollstonecraft gave birth to her second daughter, but died 10 days later, as I've told you, of obstetric septicemia. In the introduction to the 1889 edition of her letters, which I've mentioned, it is suggested, what many people probably thought at the time, that her scandalous conduct had brought about this conclusion. The baby daughter, and this is a picture of Wollstonecraft probably done in the last year of her life. The baby daughter, as we know, was also to play a celebrated role as an adult. As the wife of the poet Percy Shelley, at the age of 20, Mary Shelley wrote one of the most celebrated and least well understood Gothic novels of the early 19th century, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, published in 1818. Like the works of her mother, Mary Shelley's was an exploration of the relationship between nature and culture, between emotion and reason, and the challenge offered by science to the idea of creation.